Foucault articulates several modes of power: absolutist, juridical, and disciplinary in his book, Discipline and Punish. So discipline is one of the most intriguing and widely discussed concept in Foucault. You all are aware that he's already spoken about the absolutist monarchical or sovereign form of power, which involved punishment as a theatrical ritual of public torture. He details this kind of punishment so that the members of society who were witnessing this absolute power of the sovereign therein learn to obey, because crimes were committed against the sovereign. This is the thought which was predominant in the classical age. Through interrogation, convicts would confess their crimes in formal ceremonies involving oath, making a juridical torture, where the accused accepted the charge, recognized its truth, and quite importantly, helped produce the truth of that matter. By the late 18th and 19th century, Foucault writes, the gloomy festival of punishment was dying out, though here and there it flickered momentarily into life. The decrease in punishment as a spectacle of public torture and interrogation was matched by an increase in a different type of power, which he calls discipline. Now, this discipline is more justified as it is considered to be humane. The body of the convict was no longer treated as a site of torture for public spectacle. Instead, it became necessary for the law to reach and manipulate the body of the convict. So he talks about the disciplinary mechanism, and he discusses this in part 3 of the book, where he talks about the docile bodies. He uses the concept of panopticon and shows how this kind of disciplinary power is different from the power of the sovereign or any other juridical kind of power. So what happened in the classical age was that it discovered body as an object and target of power. So Man the Machine is a writing, which was written in 2 registers, namely anatomico-metaphysical register, which considered the body to be docile, and the other one, technico-political register, made by regulations and empirical calculable methods which were followed in army, hospital, school, in order to control or organize the body to make it more productive. So these are the 2 ways in which the bodies were subjected, used, transformed, and improved. Now, the prerequisite for a docile body was a pliable body or a manipulable body. So he begins the docile bodies by talking about the ideal figure of a soldier in the early 17th century. And this soldier, he says, shows several signs which are quite proper to his profession. But at the same hand, it also shows how all his movements are controlled, and he's just like a machine which has been constructed by some kind of calculated constraints over time. And also in the process, while training him to be so docile, he has also become a kind of a recognizable figure of the society. So body is the object and target of power, and docility, the notion of docility, Foucault tries to explain, is the analyzable body becoming a manipulable body. He writes, a body is docile that may be subjected, used, transformed, and improved. The celebrated automata, on the other hand, were not only a way of illustrating an organism, they were also political puppets, small-scale models of power. And he illustrates this with the example of Frederick II, the king, who was very fond of maintaining well-trained regiments, which went through long exercises, and they were like small machines who were operating for the king. So docility was of much interest in the 18th century, as now the body had become an object of imperious and pressing investments. Every society, the body was in grip of very strict powers, which imposed on it constraints, prohibitions, and obligations. So in this process, he says, the body now was through a process of meticulous operations, it was disciplined. So this kind of disciplining, he says, is quite beneficial for the society as it produces several productive units. He not only talks about army, the soldier, he also talks about the schools, the prisons, monasteries, the factories, because the mechanics of power, which was holding and operating the bodies, was visible in all different organizations of the society. So this subtle coercion through which the movements, gestures, attitudes of the body were controlled, and the purpose of controlling all these bodies was to find a relationship of docility and utility. And this is what Foucault means when he writes that this is a disciplinary mechanism. So now, in the course of 17th and 18th century, the disciplines became a journal formula of domination also, because they were different from slavery. They were not based on a relation of appropriation of bodies. The elegance of the discipline lay in the fact, he writes, that it could dispense with this costly and violent relation by obtaining effects of utility at least as great. So there was a difference, the kind of obedience that was generated through this mechanic of power and operation, which constantly was keeping an eye or was regulating the behavior of even the small fragment of the body, was to increase the utility of particular units. So this process, this discipline produced subjects, practiced bodies, docile bodies, but eventually it turned them into objects as well, because disciplinary coercion establishes in the body the constricting link between an increased aptitude and an increased domination. So the human body was now entering into a time and phase when this was to be explained as a machinery of power. And this is something that Foucault explores in the Docile Bodies, part 3 of the book Discipline and Punish. So in order to produce this docility, utility, productivity, or discipline, the regimes or the organizations followed several methods, which included a discipline by distributing the individuals into spaces, enclosures. So be it a prison, a school, or a factory, it was an enclosure which was a place of heterogeneous collection, but it had to be disciplined into a productive unit. So it was believed that discipline increases the forces of the body, and because its utility in terms of economics, and it diminishes these forces. Again, in the political terms, it is obedience. So it was this kind of disciplinary mechanism was operational through these enclosures, which became the functional sites. And again, by explaining these functional sites, Foucault makes a reference to the medical supervision. He says, medical supervision or medical control, what happens during the spread of epidemics and pandemics, is the best example to explain how the will of the individual can be controlled, and the individuals totally surrender to this kind of or they get disciplined to this kind of a mechanism, because they know that whatever the state or the institution is doing is for their betterment and for their good health. So he says, in the process of disciplining, what happens is a creation of ranks also happens, because when the individuals are confined into an enclosure, these enclosures are like observatories where constantly the individuals are being watched, their activities are being watched, and therefore this gives rise to a hierarchy where one individual is on a higher rank and the other one is on the lower rank, and they are coordinating for the collection of that data or the collection of that information, where even the minutest detail or activity of a person is of great importance for them to reach that kind of an arrangement where everyone is contributing to the productivity and better utility of that organization. So the control, he says, is imposed through various timetables, and this is a timetable which we all are quite aware of. We had in the schools, we have in the educational institutions, higher education. So this is a way in which, time pattern of a person is controlled. So adding to this, they also had a system of regular long routine or exercises and examination. And again, the examination system resulted in creation of the hierarchies. So this is how the natural body became a seat of several operations, whether they were through a timetable or they were through some other kind of things, exercises, or they had to do, or the examination they had to undergo. So the disciplinary control of activity belonged to a whole series of researchers, and it was discovered that the specific purpose was to control the behavior, to organize the behavior of the docile bodies. Now, the body required to be docile in its minutest operation opposes and shows the conditions and of functioning of properly, and the disciplinary power has as its correlative an individuality that is not only analytical and cellular but also natural and organic. Again, he goes on further to give an example of a school, where a record is maintained and how the bodies are regulated and rearranged. And this rearrangement of the activities is quite evident, he says, in the army as well, which is the purpose of which is to enhance the skills of the soldiers, to develop their abilities or inclinations so that they contribute to the progression of the society. This macro and micro physics of power, of discipline, he says, is possible through a seriation of successive activities over a duration of time, would always result in the progress of the society. So when he talks about the prisons, he says this was the purpose of the prisons, because due to the several reforms that were taking place, the individual had to be reformed so that when he left the prison, he would be a productive unit of the society. And it also, this kind of a skill development ensured that they did not, anyone who was convicted for a crime did not get back into the prison, committing the same or say a severe crime again. So he says this placing of the bodies as docile bodies through discipline was very, very essential to conceptualize an organization or to frame an organization which was more productive.